All right, folks, I'm ready to get started here. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the end of the third week together. So we've been together 3 weeks now. Things are moving along. The semester is about to get serious for you, so I hope you are taking it seriously now versus when things start to pile up on you. You got a weekend coming up, lots of time to catch up on the stuff we've covered, the stuff you've covered on other classes. Don't use the extra time as an excuse to just enjoy your lives. This is not the time to focus on enjoying your lives. That's what summer's for. That's what the winter break is for. Now is the time to get as much work done as possible so that you do really well here. Make this all worth something, mean something, rather than just you just doing what you're supposed to do. This is not that. This is not you doing what you're supposed to do. This is you building something, building a foundation for a future that is worth living for. So take it seriously. Take advantage of this time that you have. All right. So as far as the class goes, there was a question back there. If you have other questions, please raise your hand. It's whatever the syllabus says. So the syllabus has all the dates on it. Yeah. So just make sure. Unless I state in class, which I would also state in email, that things have changed, then they don't change. Yeah. We're covering the rest of Chapter 4 today, and we're starting Chapter 5. And I think the first test covers Chapters 1 through either 7 or 8. I forget which it is. So there's a few weeks left still before the first exam. The first exam tends to be rather late relative to other classes. So just keep that in mind. But then the second exam is pretty close, and then the third one is obviously the final, and then that is when it is. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the reason why the first exam is kind of so far in is because all this stuff that we're covering is very connected. It's all about the market model that we've been covering beyond Chapter 2 that was about introducing models and therefore the comparative advantage and production possibility frontier models were introduced there. But beyond that, we're using the market model. And so you would see in upper division courses, a lot of this stuff is covered in 2 or 3 chapters. So it's not as much as it seems. And again, use my lectures as a guide. I choose what you should be focusing on. So my lectures are the primary source of information for you. That's what the exams are based on. And then the book is meant to just expand your knowledge of the things we're covering, give you a little bit more insight. And so you should be reading the book as well, not just paying attention to my lectures, because it will again, just deepen your understanding of what we're covering. This stuff will have relevance for you beyond this course if you're in the business program, or planning to be in the business program. Without a doubt, this will have a lot of relevance for you. But if, again, you're just taking this course as a general GE course, the book stuff, because the stuff I present in class is meant to give you as much insight as possible into this approach, these tools that we use in economics. The book will have more practical knowledge that kind of relates what we're talking about to more real world stuff that that might be useful to those of you that aren't going to use this class as a springboard to go further into the business program. One other thing I wanted to mention about the book. So the book I choose is a very specific book. It's written by this economist. His name is Paul Krugman. He writes for the New York Times. He won a Nobel Prize. He's a very liberal type of economist, which is rare. And so his perspective is valuable, and that's why the book tends to be a little bit on the more expensive end than you'll find in a lot of the econ books. But it's important for you to kind of be aware of why that is. You're getting a perspective that you can trust ultimately, or else you're just getting a book by some random author, and you never know where they're coming from. And sometimes you will encounter economic perspectives that are politically biased, but not forthright about it, and sort of presenting information as truth rather than perspective. And that can be problematic. And if you're not thinking critically, or it's not allowing you to think critically because of the way it's being presented, then it can take you down the wrong path as far as like how you think about things based on your exposure to the information. So just know that the book we use is something that you can trust. And Paul Krugman, he's very clear about where he's coming from, why, like, he'll highlight certain examples versus others. So it's worth the money that you pay for it. All right, that's what I wanted to say about the book. Any other questions about anything before I jump forward with today's material? All right, so we'll finish chapter 4 today. I'll open up that homework. This will be due the middle of next week as well. And then beyond that, it'll start being due on Sunday nights. And I hope you have been, doing the readings and doing the homework assignments. If not, make sure you get, caught up this weekend. Like, it's not going to get less complicated. It's going to get more complicated as we move forward. And so, as I said, like, this class itself is not difficult, like, inherently, as far as like the stuff we're covering. What's difficult about it is like we cover a lot of like segments of complicated information that have their own sort of like intricacies. And even though you might sit in class and like get what I'm talking about, prior to an exam when you've got all of them to kind of review and just remind yourself of your understanding of, that's where it can become weighty, on top of the fact that you have other stuff from other classes you need to be learning, and other things happening in your life, whatever. So that's why it's important to, as we're moving through this stuff, to try to learn it as best as possible, so that you are not put into that position later where you're like trying to like ideally just remember a bunch of stuff that you already learned, but definitely not trying to learn a bunch of stuff that you haven't learned the right way the first time around. So remember, weeks of material, like, there's a reason why it takes weeks to present them versus just a few days before the exam. So that's why you just don't leave that much information to be covered in such a short amount of time. If you do that, it's not going to go well for you. And a class like this is always challenging, no matter where you take it, no matter who you take it from. It is what it is. So the approach is everything. And if you are not taking the right approach, it will take you down the wrong road. All right, so chapter 4, we started covering consumer and producer surplus. It's the way that we sort of gauge how well a market is operating. So we covered consumer and producer surplus, which I believe I'll do a quick review of today of what we did last time. And then we'll jump into just overall, like, what it means together for these to be at their maximum, to be at the most possible. And just briefly talk about like the relationship between these like well-functioning markets and a market economy as a whole. And again, using consumer surplus as a gauge of that. And then we'll jump into chapter 5, where we'll start talking about the intervention of government into markets like this, and like sort of the effects they can have, and how we can analyze those effects using the concepts of consumer and producer surplus. So governments will often impose what are called price controls on markets, depending on different situations, different circumstances that might call for different approaches. So you might have a market where a price is considered too high, and so then a government will set a price below the equilibrium, whatever the market's trying to set. Or in other situations, the price might be considered too low, and so then the government might come in and do what they do to place the price above the equilibrium, and we'll talk about how they do that. Today we'll only cover the first case, which is the price ceiling. The price ceiling is setting a price below the equilibrium, because below the equilibrium, we know that market forces will drive the price up to equilibrium. And so the market wants to get higher than the price below it. And so that's where an effective price ceiling would land. It would act as a means of sort of stopping those forces from going where they want to get to. So we'll talk about the mechanics of that and how it affects consumer and producer surplus and what that means by the end of today. And then that'll be it. So we won't finish chapter 5 today. So that's that. Yeah, that's actually for next time, the controlling quantities part. All right, so previously, just really quick, just to remind you what consumer and producer surplus is. So there's a willingness to buy in a market by consumers, right? Everybody is willing to purchase goods at a certain price. But fortunately, because we all live in this market economy and we interact in these markets, we don't have to pay the price that we're willing to pay if the price is above the market price. We just have to pay the price that the market is setting, the market clearing price, the equilibrium price. So oftentimes, there will be market participants, consumers, whose willingness to buy will exceed the market price. And so the difference between what they're willing to pay and what they have to pay is their individual consumer surplus. So you have individual consumer surplus, just the individual amount of excess willingness to buy. So we looked at this market for books for just a few consumers, which is why the demand function was kind of like this step shape. And we saw that like at a price of $30, Alicia, she's willing to pay $59. So the difference between what she's willing to pay on the price is $29. So that's her individual consumer surplus. Then you can add all the individual consumer surpluses to get to the total consumer surplus, which ultimately in economics, when we're just talking about any kind of consumer surplus, we just call it consumer surplus. So if we're talking about an individual's consumer surplus or consumer surplus for the entire market, we just call it consumer surplus. But if you're going to make your analysis more precise, then yeah, you start using the more specific terms. But just understand that all of it's basically talking about the same thing, as long as you understand what it is that's being talked about, the excess willingness to buy. So in a market where you have a bunch of buyers, not just a few that resulted in the step shaped demand function, just a normal market with a ton of buyers, you're going to have a smooth demand curve. And if there's a certain price being set in the market, then the area below the demand curve and above that price will represent the consumer surplus in the market. And you can measure that consumer surplus by just taking the area of the triangle, which is dependent on your ability to remember the basic formula for the area of a triangle: 1/2 the base times the height. So again, you just look at the base. In this case, it would be the quantity demanded at the price, and then the height is the difference between the y-intercept for the graph for our demand curve and the price, and then multiply it by 1/2. You get the amount in this example to be $2,700. So there's $2,700 in excess willingness to pay in this market beyond what people have to pay. And then we looked at what happens to the consumer surplus when a price changes. We looked at a price dropping from $30 to $20 in this market where there are only a few people selling their used bookstore. Buying their used book at the bookstore. And we saw that dropping the price means that existing buyers will increase their consumer surplus by the difference between the old price and the new price. And then you'll have some extra consumer surplus that comes in from the new market participants that are having their willingness to pay met. So Darren was only willing to pay $25 for the book. At $30, he wasn't willing to buy the book, but when the price dropped to $20, Darren was willing to buy the book, and he also got to benefit from the market by having some consumer surplus. 25 is his willingness to pay, 20 is what he had to pay, so $5 in consumer surplus is what he had. And again, we can look at the effect of a change in the price on the consumer surplus for a normal market where there's a bunch of buyers in the market. So at a price of $5,000, consumer surplus is just the area of this triangle up here. But if the price drops to $1,500, then all these people that were willing to buy the book and had excess willingness to pay now have this rectangle in more consumer surplus. Each of their excess willingness to pay is now even greater than it was before. And you have a bunch of new buyers at the new price that also have consumer surplus. So the dark blue triangle represents the new consumer surplus from the new buyers that now enter the market because their willingness to pay is being met. We also talked about the other side of the market and how there is also a benefit to sellers, the producer surplus. That is a similar concept, but just from a different perspective, because sellers have a cost to produce, to sell whatever it is they're selling. If the price is meeting their costs, then they will have an individual producer surplus. So in this case, we've got like what is this? 5 different people that are willing to sell their book to the bookstore, and they have a certain cost associated with the book. And if the price exceeds that, then they will be willing to sell in the market. If it does not, they will not. So this price is $30. Donna's willingness to sell is $35 because that's her cost of the book. So she's not willing to sell. Engelbert is $45. He has a $45 cost of selling the book. His is not being met, so he's not going to sell. But all these other folks, their willingness to sell is being met. Their cost is being met. Carlos has a cost of $25. He gets to sell the book for $30. 30 minus 25 is the value of his individual producer surplus. Betty, again, she has some. So does Andrew. In a market where you have a bunch of sellers, not just 6, and you have a normal upward sloping smooth supply curve, then the producer surplus can be measured as the area below the price that's being set in the market and above the supply curve. So again, it's going to be the area of a triangle. So again, you would do the base times the height times 1/2 to get the area of this triangle. You would need this number here to get the height of this. We didn't calculate it here. We calculated another one later, but anyway, it's the same thing. It's an area of a triangle. Just make sure you can get the information if you're asked to do so. When prices change, producer surplus also changes. So in this case, the price went up. So initially the price was here. You've got all these sellers whose cost is being met, and thus they were already willing to sell at $5 in the market, and they all had an excess willingness to sell, which is their individual producer surplus. Which, if you again add it together and take the area of this triangle, you would get the total producer surplus at a price of $5 in this market. When the price goes up to $7, again, you're going to have more sellers whose willingness to sell is being met, their cost is being met, and so they enter the market. So now they have some new consumer producer surplus that exists in the market, and all those folks that were selling before have an increase in producer surplus as well. So we see that as prices change, the producer and consumer surplus also changes, and later we'll look at how some of it might be redistributed when we look at how the government affects the market and thus the welfare of the market, which is how we describe the amount of surplus in the market and how it can be kind of shuffled around depending on what's happening with the price. All right, let's continue on with this chapter. This is just a quick question from your homework. The table producer surplus, this table here, shows a producer surplus for phantom tickets. I guess some tickets being sold to the Phantom of the Opera. And it shows the minimum price at which each of the students is willing to sell their ticket to Phantom of the Opera. So that's their willingness to sell. That's essentially representing their cost. Assume that each student has only one ticket to sell. If the price for Phantom tickets is $140 and there's no other market for tickets, total producer surplus for the 5 students will be, so then you would need to calculate it, right? So what is the producer surplus for Tim? $139, right? The difference between the price he gets to charge and his willingness to sell, which represents his cost, right? So for Tim, it's $139. How much is it for Laura? It's $110, right? Difference between $140 and $30. Laura has a producer surplus of $110. What about Whitney? $90 for Whitney. $140 is what she'll sell it for. $50 is what it cost her. So that's $90 for Whitney. What about Ralph? $40, right? Ralph cost him $100 and he's selling for $140. So the difference between that is $40. That's his individual producer surplus. What about Rick? Is it negative 10? Does he even have producer surplus? No. Why not? He's not willing to sell, right? The price does not meet his cost, so therefore Rick will not sell, right? So there is no excess anything. There is a negative, but that means that he's not going to sell. So therefore Ralph is 40, so if you add the three together, you get a total producer surplus, in this case, of $379. I will expect you to do small calculations on the exam. So you should, like I mentioned before, bring a calculator. Don't bring a graphing calculator, just a regular old calculator. I will not allow phones. I know phones have calculators in them. I will not ever allow a phone out during an exam. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you grab a calculator. They're cheap. Bring it to class for the exam.
Can I bring a graphing calculator if I have one?
I would prefer not, because graphing calculators can save data, so I would prefer not. What's that? Right, but the ones that do are likely the ones that would do it. So I'm sure the majority of you are honest people. We live in a world where there are dishonest people, surprisingly. Some people aren't honest, and they will do anything to get away with anything. And I have to always account for that. I'm sorry for everybody else that has to deal with it. All right, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the gains from trade. So let's bring it all together and just kind of highlight how this allows us to sort of just establish how well a market is working, and kind of reflects, like, again, like that important principle that we covered at the beginning of the class that underlies a lot of our approach, which is that there are gains from trade. If people specialize in the things they do and then they trade amongst each other, then we can all benefit more than if we just kind of did our own thing and did everything ourselves. All right, gains from trade. So consumer plus producer surplus is what we term total surplus, the total surplus of the market. It's the overall welfare of the market is what we say. Again, that term welfare is specific to us talking about the producer and consumer surplus in a market. We're not talking about the welfare that we always talk about in normal everyday conversation that has to do with government transfers to people. So just remember, whenever we're talking about things in this class and we're using words, they're very specific to the class and the discipline. So you have to be able to kind of separate yourself from what you already know with respect to some terminology to what the class defines that terminology to be. It doesn't mean that you have to redefine the way you think. It just means you have to be able to kind of organize these definitions in your head so that you don't mistakenly depend on your intuition about certain words to try to answer things, because that is a mistake and that will lead you down a bad road. Like drugs. Except for legal pot in California. All right. And it's not completely legal, by the way. Be very careful, and you have to be over the age of 21, so relax. All right, so the figure in the market reaches equilibrium here at $30 per book, and 1,000 books are bought and sold at that price. So again, we understand that the market sets an equilibrium. It happens at the point where demand and supply intersect. We have an upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve. Price is on the vertical axis. Quantity is on the x-axis. And the market forces drive the price to be at equilibrium, which is, in this case, $30. And the equilibrium quantity, the amount that's bought and sold, is 1,000 books. Both consumers and producers are better off because there is a market in this good. And we know that because at $30, you've got this much consumer surplus, right? The area below the demand curve, above the equilibrium price. And there's this much producer surplus, the area below the price and above the supply curve. So we can see that in this example, because the market is allowed to equilibrate, get to its equilibrium, then the total surplus is at the most it possibly can be. The market is doing as well as a market can do. So it illustrates another core principle of economics. There are gains from trade. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but let's just do this quick homework question from chapter 4, question 13. Assume the supply curve for corn is upward sloping. In the market for corn, a primary input into the production of ethanol, So corn is an input into the production of ethanol, and we're looking at the market for corn. Total surplus blanks when the price of ethanol increases. So it can either increase, does not change, decrease, or the answer cannot be determined. All right, so in order to figure out what's going to happen to surplus, we can graph our market, right? We can have an upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand. It sets an equilibrium in this case. Let's say just randomly $1.50 is the price, and that 400,000 pounds per day of corn are being produced. Okay, so corn is an input for ethanol, and the price of ethanol increases. So what do you think is going to happen in the market for corn? Demand? I heard something about demand. Okay, this is the market for corn, right? Corn is used to make ethanol. The price of ethanol has gone up. Who uses corn in the market for ethanol? Suppliers, right? So if the price is going up in the ethanol market, suppliers are going to increase their what? The price is going up, so suppliers are going to increase quantity. No, suppliers are going to increase their quantity supplied, right? The price is affecting them. It again reflects the relationship between price and quantity supplied, which is embodied in the supply curve, right? So if the price is going up in the ethanol market, they're increasing their quantity supplied, right? We're just moving along the supply curve versus the whole curve shifting, which is an increase in supply versus an increase in quantity supplied. You have to be very specific about this. Don't get mixed up, and make sure you get that down. All right. So we know that they are increasing their quantity supplied in the ethanol market. So therefore, what's going to happen to their demand for corn? It's going to increase, right? Demand will increase in the corn market because the price in the ethanol market is going up, and suppliers now want more corn so they can make more ethanol, right? So they can increase their quantity supplied in the ethanol market. So what's going to happen here? Graphically. Which curve is going to be affected here? Demand, right? This is for corn, not ethanol. Ethanols are there are producers of ethanol that now want to produce more ethanol because the price is going up, right? So that means that their demand for corn will go up, right? So what's going to happen to this curve? It's going to shift to the right. Exactly. It's going to shift to the right. What's going to happen to equilibrium price? It's going to go up, right? What's going to happen to equilibrium quantity? It's going to go up as well, right? So here we are originally at our old equilibrium before anything's happened. What is this triangle here? It's the producer surplus, the area below the price and above the supply curve. What is that? Consumer surplus. Very good. All right. The question is asking, what's going to happen to total surplus when the price of ethanol increases? What do you think is going to happen? It's going to increase, right? Let's look at why. So demand is going to shift to the right, right? So now you're going to have a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity. Both of them are going to be higher than before. So now you've got all these sellers that now are going to enter the market, and they're going to want to sell too, right? So you're going to have our old producer surplus plus more producer surplus. So that's going to be our new producer surplus, right? The area below the new price and above the supply curve. What happened on the supply side of this market? Before we were over here, now we're over here. What happened to the supply side of the market? Increase in quantity supplied, yes. We had an increase in quantity supplied because the price went up, because demand increased, and that means now the quantity supplied has increased. We have moved up and along the supply curve as a result of demand increasing. Demand increased and led to an increase in quantity supplied. All right. So that's our new producer surplus. And we have a new consumer surplus as well. Demand has shifted to the right. So the area below the demand curve and above the price is a new consumer surplus. So we see that that is certainly greater than the old total surplus that we had in the market. So total surplus has most definitely increased. But you had to do the whole analysis in your head in order to figure out the answer to this question, which you could do graphically by drawing stuff on the side of an exam if you had a question like this. Not to say that you will, but I'm just saying, like, this is how you figure things out using the market model to analyze the effects of changes in one market related to another market. Who knows? It can be complicated or it can be simple, but you should be able to do all of it because you have the tools to do so. So remember, this class is like a math course where, like, you're given tools, right? And then you're asked to apply those tools and figure things out with them. Some people sometimes think that this is more like a philosophy course where we all come and talk about economics and talk about how we feel about it and what you think about it, what I think about it. It's like, no, it's not. Like, economics is an approach. It's like a technical type, a science that needs like a very precise set of language and methodology that is applied to it in order to get the kind of results that mean something. And so this is not the class where you discuss, the economy. This is a class where you learn tools. If you move forward in economics, you'll eventually get to classes where everybody's talking about stuff. But like initially, like it's about like just learning the tools and then being able to apply them properly in a precise way so that what you're saying makes sense, what your results are makes sense. All right, so that's that. Let's talk about the efficiency of market. So we talked about the fact that markets provide gains from trade. So in chapter 1, we made an even bigger claim that markets are usually efficient. So we talked about efficiency and how producer and consumer surplus, when they're at the most they can be in a particular situation, then we say the market is efficient. So the analysis of consumer and producer surplus helps us understand why markets are usually efficient. So imagine the opposite case where the markets aren't left to do their own thing to get to that equilibrium that will maximize producer and consumer surplus. Maximizing producer and consumer surplus essentially means like having the most gains from trade possible, because again, like you have all these people that are willing to pay more that don't have to. You have a bunch of folks that are producing at a certain cost, but they get to charge a price above that. And those are all the gains from trade that a market provides for. But imagine that you have like a command economy type of situation, like I've mentioned before in the Soviet Union, where the government takes control of markets and says, we're not going to let the market do what it wants to do. We're going to decide what markets are going to do. We're going to decide who's going to sell to whom and who's going to get what. So imagine a committee in this kind of like command economy charged with improving the market equilibrium by deciding who gets a used textbook and who gives up a used textbook. The committee's goal is to bypass the market outcome and devise another arrangement that would produce higher total surplus. So don't, like, remember, I mentioned before, and I'll keep mentioning it, like, you'll see a lot of text sometimes, but stuff like this is just meant to kind of give you context, to give you a broader understanding of what we're talking about and why the tools we use work the way they do and what it all kind of means. But I don't expect you to memorize this, like I need you to kind of just learn the terminology, learn the models, and be able to apply them properly, and that will be enough. But again, this is about like reinforcing the logic behind the model and the conclusions that you can get by using the model to analyze situations. So again, we're imagining a situation where we're not letting the market do what it wants, and a committee is deciding. They can take one of three approaches. So let's look at these three approaches. The one is to reallocate consumption amongst consumers. So the committee might try to increase total surplus by, let's say, selling books to different consumers. So the committee is trying to increase surplus, not letting the market do what it wants. It thinks it can decide how to make the market work better. So it might decide to sell books to different consumers. So let's say we have points A and B here. You've got two different consumers. A is Anna and B is Bob. Anna is willing to pay $35 for the book. Bob is willing to pay $25 for the book. Since the market equilibrium price is $30, under the market outcome, we know that Anna will buy the book, and she will have a consumer surplus of $5. And we know that Bob does not buy the book because his willingness to pay is not being met by the price. But suppose the committee reallocates consumption. This would mean taking the book away from Anna and giving it to Bob. Since the book is worth $35 to Anna, but only $25 to Bob, this will reduce total consumer surplus by $10. So trying to reallocate who's buying what and not letting the market do its own thing will necessarily reduce a total surplus rather than increase it. So again, the result doesn't depend on which student we pick. Every student who buys a book at the market equilibrium has a willingness to pay of $30 or more, as we know. And every student who doesn't has a willingness to pay of less than $30. So trying to reallocate the good amongst consumers always means taking a book away from someone who values it more and giving it to someone who values it less. This, again, necessarily reduces total consumer surplus, which is one of the components of total surplus. The other thing the committee might try to do is to reallocate sales among sellers. So the committee might try to increase total surplus by altering who sells the books. So it might take away from sellers who would have sold their books at the market equilibrium and instead compel those who would not have sold their books at the market equilibrium to sell them. So let's say we've got these 2 points here, X and Y. X is Javier, and whose cost is $25, and Y is Ivan, who has a cost of $35. If the committee reallocates sales, forcing Xavier to keep his book, who has an excess willingness to sell, right? His cost is 25, equilibrium is 30, so he has some producer surplus. If the committee says, no, we don't want Javier to sell his book, we want Ivan to sell hers, who has no excess willingness to pay, her willingness to sell. Her cost exceeds the equilibrium price, and therefore she wouldn't sell under this market outcome. But if the committee decided to make her be the one that sells and Javier not be the one that sells, then once again we're going to lose this consumer surplus, and there's going to be negative consumer surplus there. So there will be $10 in total surplus loss as a result of that. And again, it doesn't matter which students are chosen. Any student who sells a book at the market equilibrium has a lower cost than any student who keeps the book. So reallocating sales among sellers, again, necessarily increases total cost and reduces total producer surplus. And then finally, the committee could try to just change the quantity that's being traded. So lastly, the committee might try to increase total surplus by compelling students to trade either more books or fewer books than the market equilibrium quantity. So obviously this is the market equilibrium quantity. That's the amount that equilibrates the market, where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And the figure again shows Anna, Bob, Javier, and Ivan. So to reduce sales, the committee will have to prevent a transaction that would have occurred in the market equilibrium. In this case, let's say it prevents Xavier from selling to Anna. Xavier selling to Anna results in $10 of total surplus there. Since Anna is willing to pay $35 and Javier is willing to pay $25, preventing this transaction reduces total surplus by $10. And if they were to then force Yvonne to sell her book to Bob, then again, you would wind up with a negative surplus again. So ultimately, what all this is meant to highlight is, like, if you try to do anything to the market, either making consumers buy things that they wouldn't normally buy and not letting others buy the things that they would buy, forcing sellers to do things that they would normally not do based on their cost conditions, or just forcing them to interact in ways that the market wouldn't normally allow, then you are going to hurt the market. And therefore, the market should be left alone to do its own thing. Is the market perfect? No. We'll talk about the fact that it's not perfect in a second. So again, we can summarize our results by stating that at an efficient market, that an efficient market performs four important functions. One, it allocates consumption of the good to the potential buyers who most value it, as indicated by the fact that they have the highest willingness to pay. It allocates sales to the potential sellers who most value the right to sell the good, as indicated by the fact that they have the lowest cost. It ensures that every consumer who makes a purchase values the good more than every seller who makes a sale, so that all transactions are mutually beneficial. And finally, it ensures that every potential buyer who doesn't make a purchase values the good less than a potential seller who doesn't make a sale, so that no mutually beneficial transactions are missed. So the market, left to its own devices, will do the best it can given what is happening in the market. Three caveats, though. Markets aren't perfect. So although a market may be efficient, it isn't necessarily fair. So the efficient outcome, the one that maximizes the welfare of the market as measured by total surplus, producer and consumer surplus, that may not necessarily be equitable. It may not be fair. And again, fairness is something that the political system needs to decide how to deal with, how to sort of reach a consensus about, versus like the economic analysis that we do on markets. We also have to acknowledge that markets do sometimes fail. So when this occurs, markets no longer maximize total surplus. So we'll talk about those cases today. I'll list a few of them right now, but definitely we'll be highlighting them very precisely as we move through the course. And finally, the third caveat, even when the market equilibrium maximizes total surplus, this does not mean that it results in the best outcome for every individual consumer and producer, right? So you could have a situation where like there might be an equilibrium rent in a market, and because of that, you have a bunch of people that just can't pay for the rent. So you have a bunch of homeless people, and then you might have a bunch of homes that nobody's buying, and they're just sitting there empty. So, and we see that all the time, obviously. Markets aren't perfect. Markets fail, and governments play a role in that. That was one of our principles as well. When markets fail, there is a role for government to be played. But it's important to acknowledge when that should happen and when that shouldn't happen. And a lot of it, the should part, has to do with like your own sort of beliefs that should be married with like precise analysis to be able to, be clearly explained. So other things equal, each buyer would like to pay a lower price and each seller would like to receive a higher price, but sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. If the government were to intervene in the market, the outcome would no longer be efficient, though, under certain circumstances. Although some people would be happier, total surplus would be lower. So let's again continue talking about this connection between equity, fairness, and efficiency. Efficiency is about how to achieve goals, not what those goals should be. So again, like that's about, us deciding as a society via our political institutions to come to a consensus about, not necessarily markets themselves. So what efficiency does address is the best way to achieve a goal once it has been determined. It's easy to get carried away with the idea that markets are always right and that economic policies that interfere with efficiency are bad. It's easy to, and people do run away with that. In fact, people use that all the time to justify why governments should not be involved in markets. But that would be misguided because there's another fact to consider. Society cares about equity or what is fair, right? Like people do care about that. We see what's happening right now with the government where, you have certain figures being placed in very important positions. They're going to have a lot of influence over our lives. And a lot of people do believe that they are rightfully fitted for those positions. But obviously we know that a lot of people also do not believe that. And so again, it's about like us sort of having that push and pull via our political process to try to come to the best possible result. Sometimes that best possible result is not going to be what we consider the best possible result. But it's just the nature of, a society that has like, in our case, we have like 300 million people. Like it's difficult to come to that kind of consensus. But again, society does care about equity and fairness. So it's important to realize that a society's choice to sacrifice some efficiency for the sake of equity, however it defines equity, is a valid one. So there are situations in which, if we come together and say, yes, we should intervene in markets, even though it will screw up efficiency, that it's fine, that we should do it. And we'll talk about that when we get to the first section of the next chapter, which we'll start in a second. The problem lies in the fact that fairness is a concept about which well-intentioned people often disagree. And again, like, what is fair? What your definition of fair is different than my definition of fair, is different than everybody else's. And our own definitions of fairness may differ based on whatever situation we're thinking about. And so we need to be careful about that. All right, and just a few words on a market economy overall, economy that is made up of markets, which is what our economy is made up of, and most economies that work today as best as possible are. An economy is essentially made up of a bunch of markets. There's markets for goods and services, the things that are bought, that are produced and then bought and sold to consumers. There's money markets that are part of financial markets that involve selling and buying financial assets. There's international markets, which are essentially the same, but just one country buying from the rest of the world and vice versa. There's the factor markets where the factors of production are bought and sold. So households sell their labor, they sell their capital to firms. So all those markets essentially are the economy. And so, as we learned earlier, in a market economy, decisions about production and consumption are always made via markets. The economy as a whole is made up of these interrelated markets. Consumers and producers do not make decisions in isolated markets. Markets affect each other. So when all markets in the economy are maximizing total surplus as well as possible, then the economy as a whole is said to be efficient. When an economy is efficient, it is impossible to make a single market better off without making another market worse off. So generally, when you have that kind of efficiency throughout an economy and you try to affect one market, it will affect the other markets as well. So it's important to realize that this is a theoretical result. It's virtually impossible to find an economy in which every market is efficient. So this notion of the economy as a whole being efficient is sort of the ideal, right? You always have to kind of be aiming to like the best case scenario. And it's also important to understand that we're not living in an ideal world and things are imperfect. And so we do need to sort of accept that and also be able to understand it. You can't simply just say, oh, well, things aren't working great. Well, why aren't things working great? Well, let's talk about that. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Does that lack of efficiency maybe allow for some equity? Is that a trade-off that our society is willing to make? If so, then it's okay that our economy is not efficient. But we need to be able to discuss these things in very precise, clear terms so everybody knows what we're talking about. Why markets typically work so well? Well, a well-functioning market owes, and all of them, well-functioning markets, owe their effectiveness to two powerful features, and that is property rights and the role of prices as economic signals. Property rights are the rights of owners of valuable items, whether resources or goods, to dispose those items as they choose. So if you look throughout the world and you look at the economies that are like developing or aren't doing too well, one characteristic that you're often going to find is that there are not well-defined property rights. It is not clear-cut who owns what. Maybe there's some laws in the books, but maybe like the judicial branch of their government is not enforcing those laws properly. There's so much corruption that it actually seeps into the judicial branch as well. So property rights are basically the cornerstone of how all of this works, right? Like, you have sellers, you have buyers. They come together, they set an equilibrium. But if it's not clearly defined that like what's being sold is owned by the seller and that once you pay for that, it is yours, then the market can be worthless, right? Like, we need to have clear property rights and we need to have institutions that will enforce those property rights. And if you don't have that, then all of this falls apart and it doesn't work. So again, in a system of property rights, by purchasing a good, you receive ownership rights, the right to use and dispose of the good as you see fit. Restrictions on property rights would prevent many mutually beneficial transactions from occurring. Once a system of well-defined property rights is in place, the second necessary feature of well-functioning markets is prices as signals. So an economic signal is any piece of information that helps people make better economic decisions. Prices, as I've mentioned, help us to allocate goods that are not in unlimited supplies to those that value it the most. Is that fair? Is that equitable? Well, that's not a question we're addressing, but it is efficient if people that value things the most are getting the things that are rare. Prices are the most important signals in a market economy because they convey essential information about other people's costs and their willingness to pay. Prices can sometimes fail as economic signals, though. So when there's uncertainty about the quality of a good, price alone may not be an accurate indicator of the value of the good. A well-known problem in economics is the market for lemons, a market in which prices don't work well as an economic signal. So you might have, well, the market for used cars is generally considered the market for lemons because generally people that are willing to sell their cars, you have to assume that there's something wrong with the car. And so a price is being set for that used car, and it's not an accurate signal because you don't have all the information. You don't have all the information about that car. Like, you don't know if it's really working. Maybe, a few tweaks were made to kind of make it work temporarily while, you test drive it or whatever, but you don't actually know the true value of the car. And so there are situations in which prices can fail, and the price and the market for lemons is one of them. Few words of caution. As we've seen, markets are an amazingly effective way to organize economic activity. We learned in chapter 1 in our 5th principle of interaction, when markets don't achieve efficiency, that government intervention can improve society's welfare. So you can have, of course, an inefficient situation. A market can be inefficient. So a market or an economy is inefficient if there are missed opportunities. Some people could be made better off without making other people worse off. When a market or markets are inefficient, the economy in which they are embedded is also inefficient. When a market is inefficient, we have what is called market failure. I also mentioned this in the first chapter. So market failure occurs when a market fails to be efficient. So something is stopping the market from maximizing the welfare of the participants. There are 3 common ways this happens. The first one, markets can fail in when an attempt to capture surplus, one party prevents mutually beneficial trades from occurring. So that generally happens when you have, the most extreme case is when you have like a monopolist, somebody or an entity, a firm who is a sole seller in a market, and because of that, they don't let the market equilibrate where it normally would. And so because they don't do that, the way they don't do it is that they charge prices higher than the market would normally charge because they have the power to do so, because they don't have any competition and nobody else is selling their stuff, so they can charge whatever they want. We'll talk about the mechanics of that in the second part of the chapter, second part of the course, or the third part of the course. But that's one way that the market can fail and cause inefficiency, and that is one situation in which it makes sense for the government to intervene sometimes. Another way is actions of individuals sometimes have side effects on the welfare of others that markets don't take into account. So there are external costs to the behavior of market participants. So in economics, these side effects are known as externalities. The best known example is pollution, right? So you have a seller of like paper that is running a paper mill and has a bunch of industrial waste that they're dumping in the local river. Nobody's stopping them from doing so. It would cost them money to try to actually dispose of it properly. Nobody's forcing them to do that, and so they have this externality, this external cost that they impose upon us. When that happens, it's important for the government to come in, and what the government usually will do is they'll make that cost tangible to the polluter, right? They'll have a fine if they pollute, which then will represent a cost to them of polluting, which then will make them to internalize that cost and then behave more efficiently. So again, we can think of the problem of pollution as a problem of incomplete property rights, since existing property rights don't guarantee a right of ownership of clean air. So because of that, you have the problem of pollution, and therefore the government needs to take a role in those situations. So in chapter 16, we'll talk about pollution, other externalities that give rise to inefficiency. And the third way that the market can fail is that some goods themselves, some goods and services, are not by their very nature suited for the efficient management of markets. So markets are good for dealing with what are called private goods. And there's two characteristics of private goods that you don't need to know right now. You'll need to know it at the end of the class, end of the course. They are exhaustible, and they are excludable. So you can stop somebody from using private goods, and the fact that one person is using a private good means that somebody else is not, and ultimately that can run out. But if you think about like a river where there's a bunch of fish, the river with a bunch of fish is non-excludable, right? Like you can't just stop everybody from fishing. Like that's impossible. That would just kind of create like an authoritarian police state type of situation, which nobody wants. But it can be excludable, right? So in this case, I'm sorry, it can be exhaustible. So like if you are fishing too much, that means other people won't be able to fish. So the characteristics of fishes in public rivers don't fall within the private good category, and therefore markets cannot efficiently allocate them. We'll talk about the mechanics of that at the end of the course. But again, that's a third example of market failure. And chapter 20 will analyze goods that fall into this category. All right, let's start talking about chapter 5, and then we'll call it a day in about 20 minutes. All right, so price controls and quotas meddling with markets. So what we're going to learn here, we're going to learn the meaning of price controls and quantity controls and two kinds of government intervention in markets. We'll talk about how price and quantity controls create problems and can make markets inefficient. We'll talk about what dead weight loss is. We'll talk about why the predictable side effects of intervention in markets often leads economists to be skeptical of its usefulness. We'll talk about who benefits and who loses from market interventions and why they are used despite their well-known properties. All right, so just a quick sort of note on why governments control prices. So again, I mentioned like sometimes there's a need for governments to intervene when there's market failure, but sometimes a market might be efficient, and we might agree as a society that still it's important for the government to come in and intervene, even though it might cause inefficiency. So oftentimes there's a strong political demand for governments to intervene in markets. Powerful interests can make a compelling case that a market intervention favoring them is fair. So if you think about like neighborhoods where there's a certain community of folks that have been living there for a long time, a few generations maybe. All of a sudden you get a lot of investors coming into those areas. They start pumping in money into properties, bringing up property values. It's called gentrification. When that happens, rents start to go up, and that might start to price out the existing people that live in the neighborhoods to the point where people that have a legacy of living in these areas might start being driven out of those areas. So even though it might be efficient for the market to do its own thing, and for us not to say we should curb the price of rents in those areas, the people in the area have a right to say, hey, hold on, you're pricing us out. You're changing the nature of our community. You're affecting our cultural legacy here. And so they would then go to their governments and say, hey, like we need you to intervene in the market. We need you to stop prices from going too high. And so under that situation, we might all agree that that's a good thing and that the government should intervene in situations like that, which leads to situations that are called rent control situations, like we have in Santa Monica, we have it in New York, and you'll find it in different areas. So price controls in general are legal restrictions on how high or low a market price may go. There's two main types. There's a price ceiling. A price ceiling is the maximum price sellers are allowed to charge for a good or service, and it's usually going to be set below the equilibrium price. And the other case is the price floor. It's a minimum price that buyers are required to pay for a good or service, usually set above the equilibrium price. So in that case, you might have a group of folks that feel the price in the market is too low, and they need the price to be higher. The classic case is of like U.S. agricultural like independent farmers. So you have this legacy of independent farmers, and then all of a sudden, industrial age, farming becomes mechanized. That means that huge companies can just make these industrial farms and really severely lower the cost of farming, which means that they could charge really low prices for the goods. Because the small independent farms aren't able to have that kind of scale of production, then their costs won't be low. That means their prices couldn't go that low. That means their only option is to go out of business. What happened in this country is that farmers went to their representatives in Congress, and Congress said, we need to save these like individual farmers. We need to save this like legacy of independent farmers that have existed here for a long time. And so they set up a price floor in agricultural industries, which we'll talk about when we get to that example on Tuesday. But in general, it's not that easy to tell a market what to do. So it's always kind of tricky to get price controls in place. When a government tries to legislate prices, there are certain predictable and unpleasant side effects. So we're going to examine that right now. We make an important assumption in this chapter. The markets in question are efficient before the price controls are imposed, which is not necessarily the case in general. Sometimes markets may not be efficient, but just to highlight the effects on efficiency of a price control initiative, we will assume that the market is efficient. So that therefore total surplus is at its maximum before the government intervenes. When markets are inefficient, price controls don't necessarily cause problems and can potentially move the market closer to efficiency. So if you have a case of market failure, then placing price controls on those situations might actually solve the problem and create more efficiency. That's why nothing is clear cut as far as like the issues, and you should always be aware of how certain methodologies are being applied and what those conclusions are coming from. Again, like in this class, in this discipline, economics, our approach is about being as objective as possible. We practice positive economics versus normative economics, in which we try to say, no, this approach is bad, this would be better, imposing like your own sort of ideas on what should happen versus what is happening. All right, so let's talk about price ceilings. So, and then call it a day. Aside from rent control, there are not many price ceilings in the United States today. So that's basically the most common one you'll find. So let's look at how we can model a price ceiling. So an example of when a government imposes a price ceiling on an efficient market is a simplified model of the market for apartments in New York, let's say. So we've got our downward sloping demand curve, again reflecting the fact that as prices go down, quantity demanded goes up. And we've got price, in this case, monthly rent per apartment on the y-axis, and quantity of apartments demanded in millions on the x-axis. And then we've got an upward sloping supply curve, again reflecting the law of supply. As prices go up, quantity supplied goes up. And of course, we've got an equilibrium in the market. In this case, it's $1,000 per apartment for the rent, and there's 2 million apartments being rented at that equilibrium price. For simplicity, we're going to imagine that all the apartments are exactly the same, and so rent for the same, and they would all rent for the same unregulated price. Now, suppose the government imposes a price ceiling that limits rents to a price below the equilibrium price. So let's say the price ceiling is set at $800 versus that $1,000 that equilibrated the market. So at the enforced rental rate of $800, landlords have less incentive to offer apartments, right? So all of these landlords over here that would normally offer apartments that have costs higher than $800 will not offer apartments, right? On top of the ones that already were not based on the equilibrium of the market. At the same time, apartments demanded rises to 2.2 million, right? So now you've got, so before at a normal equilibrium, you've got the normal amount of buyers that correspond to that equilibrium price and quantity. But if the price is set below equilibrium, then all these buyers here now have an excess willingness to pay. And so they are now demanding apartments as well, right? So now we're going to get this amount of apartments demanded, 2.2 million, and only 1.8 million being offered in the market. So there's now a persistent shortage of rental housing at that price, right? Quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. In this case, it's 400,000 apartments caused by the rent ceiling. Now, it's important to note that like putting a price ceiling above equilibrium is not going to have any kind of effect because, as we know, when the price is above equilibrium, you've got quantity supply that exceeds quantity demanded, and therefore you're going to have a lot more available than is being purchased. So sellers start to lower their prices, these folks start to buy, and then it gets us to the equilibrium. So if you say the price cannot go above 1,200, it doesn't matter if it's above equilibrium because it doesn't want to go above 1,200, it wants to go below it naturally. So only a price ceiling that forces price below equilibrium will have an effect, or it would be what we call binding. So a binding price ceiling would only work below equilibrium. All right, so let's look at how a price ceiling causes inefficiency. How is it affecting our consumer and producer surplus, the gains from trade? So any shortage induced by price controls can be seriously harmful because it leads to inefficiency. This means that there are gains from trade that go unrealized. In addition to inefficiency, price ceilings give rise to illegal behavior as people try to circumvent them. So rent control, like all price ceilings, create inefficiency in at least 4 distinct ways. One is the inefficiently low quantity. So we saw that quantity demanded was severely greater than quantity supplied. Quantity supply was less than what it was at equilibrium, and so you have that inefficiently low quantity of apartments being transacted. In Chapter 4, we learned that the market equilibrium of an efficient market leads to the quantity that maximizes the sum of producer and consumer surplus. If the only effect of rent control was to reduce the number of apartments available, it would cause a loss of surplus. So again, here is our market in equilibrium. Quantity supply without rent control, there's our price ceiling, and here's our quantity supplied with rent control. So you see the difference between these two is the amount of transactions that don't occur because of this price ceiling. So you've got that old equilibrium price, and again, above the price, below the supply curve is the consumer surplus. Below the price and above the supply curve, I'm sorry, I think it's the supply curve, I remember demand. Anyway, above the supply and below the equilibrium price is our producer surplus. When you cut down the amount of transactions that can happen due to the price ceiling, then this many transactions don't occur, and therefore you're going to get a loss of producer surplus and a loss of consumer surplus. The amount of the loss is equal to the area of the shaded triangle in the figure, and it's what we call the deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss is the loss in total surplus that occurs whenever an action or policy reduces the quantity transacted below the efficient market equilibrium quantity. Deadweight loss is a key concept in economics, one that we will encounter whenever an action or a policy leads to a reduction in the quantity transacted below the efficient market equilibrium quantity. So whenever we lose total surplus as a result of mutually beneficial transactions not occurring, in this case, 200,000 apartments not being rented, you're going to just lose total surplus. You're going to have some deadweight loss. It's important to realize that deadweight loss is a loss to society as a whole. This whole surplus just goes away, even though it could have been it could have existed. And those that transacted under the equilibrium would have benefited from it. So it's not the same as a loss in surplus to one person that then accrues as a gain to someone else, what an economist would call a transfer of surplus from one person to another. So let's look at before rent control. We know that that's our consumer surplus, that's our producer surplus. After rent control, we know that this many transactions don't occur, so this much surplus is lost, which we call the deadweight loss. But that's not the end of the story. So before we had this entire area below the $1,000 and above the supply curve being our producer surplus. Our producer surplus now is just this triangle here. This is how many are being transacted. This is how many apartments are being supplied by the suppliers at a price of $800, which is the most they can charge. And so their producer surplus is just that triangle there. This rectangle here was producer surplus before, but under the rent control, now it is going to be part of consumer surplus. So before, consumer surplus was this whole triangle here, right? That triangle, the area below the demand curve and above the price. When the price dropped, only this many apartments are being rented. So that's how many are being consumed. So you've got these buyers that are renting the apartment, and they all have an excess willingness to pay that is the difference between what they're willing to pay and what they have to pay, which is the 800. So this whole area is going to equal then the consumer surplus, right? And part of the old producer surplus is being transferred to the consumer surplus. So there's our normal. That's the leftover consumer surplus from before, and here is the consumer surplus transferred from producers. And then here's our remaining producer surplus. All right. So again, rent control can also result in an inefficient allocation to consumers. Rent control can lead to misallocation of apartments that are available. So you might have people that need the apartments and can't get them, or you might have an apartment. Let's say there's like a woman. She had a big family, 5 kids, huge apartment, rent controlled. Worked out great when she had her family. Her kids have moved out now. They've left. She's left alone in her apartment. She should probably get a smaller place. She doesn't need a 5-bedroom place or whatever. But the rent control allows her to stay in the apartment cheaper than if she were to go out and try to find a 1-bedroom apartment that suited her. And so you might have a situation like that. So you might have an inefficient allocation to consumers. In an inefficient distribution of apartments, some people who are not especially anxious to find an apartment will get one, and others who are very anxious to find an apartment won't get one. Since people usually get apartments through luck or personal connections under rent control, it generally results in an inefficient allocation to consumers. So again, just formally speaking, we mean that some people who want the good badly and are willing to pay a high price don't get it, and some who care relatively little about the good and are only willing to pay a low price do get it. And finally, wasted resources. So another reason a price ceiling causes inefficiency is that it leads to wasted resources. Wasted resources means that people expend money, effort, and time to cope with shortages caused by a price ceiling. In 1979, the U.S. imposed price controls on gasoline, and that led to a shortage that forced millions of Americans to wait in lines for gas for hours each week. It was a result of things that were happening in the Middle East that led them to do that because the prices were going up really high. So they said, no, we can't let the price get too high. So they imposed that price ceiling. But as a result of that, you had these long lines. So then you had people having to wait in long lines. If people don't have jobs and don't have any responsibilities, then cool. The opportunity costs, not high. They can spend hours in line. But if you have people that have jobs with real responsibilities, families, extreme cases, doctors, lawyers, who could be making a lot of money servicing their clients versus waiting in line for gas, then they're going to have a higher opportunity cost to wait in line. So therefore, this situation will wind up leading to a lot of that sort of wasted time that could have been used to generate other kinds of goods and services in the economy. And finally, we can have inefficiently low quality. So a price ceiling also creates inefficiency by causing goods to be of inefficiently low quality. It means that sellers offer low quality goods at a low price, even though buyers would prefer a higher quality at a higher price. So in the rent control context, landlords have no incentive to provide better conditions. They just don't want to spend the money to uphold their properties because they aren't getting enough to justify the costs. The situation is a missed opportunity since some tenants would be happy to pay for better conditions and landlords would be happy to provide them for payment. Such an exchange would occur only if the market were allowed to operate freely. And then lastly, of course, black markets. Price ceilings can provide incentives for illegal activities, specifically the emergence of black markets. A black market is a market in which goods or services are bought and sold illegally because it is illegal to sell them at all, or because the prices charged are legally prohibited by a price ceiling. So in general, black markets are a bad thing if people break any laws. It encourages disrespect for the law in general. In this case, illegal activity worsens the position of those who are honest. So again, laws aren't perfect, but laws, part of the laws are property rights, and that's the cornerstone of an economy. So why are there price ceilings? One answer is that although price ceilings may have adverse effects, they do benefit some people. In a rent control context, a small minority of renters get much cheaper housing than they would get in an unregulated market. Also, when price ceilings have been in effect for a long time, buyers may not have a realistic idea of what would happen without them. And so they would actually wind up paying higher than they would normally. All right, folks, we are done. Have a good weekend. I will open up Chapter 4's homework for you to get done by the middle of next week. And then beyond that, homeworks will be due on Sunday night. Have a good weekend. Work hard. See you next Tuesday.